Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Luke Hunt. This is another podcast for The Diplomat, and with me today is a Cambodian veteran, Hans van Zoggel, who predates pretty much nearly all the Westerners who have lived in Cambodia. Hans, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Luke.
And you started out as a teacher back in the Netherlands, maths, Dutch, English, and that was in 1979 as the Vietnamese were moving into Cambodia and ousting the Khmer Rouge. So different days.
Yeah, that's right. My first engagement was indeed with the Vietnamese boat refugees in 1980.
Right.
And, most of them were young people. And I come from a rural, small village in the south of the Netherlands and grew up in a pretty basic, poor family situation and became a teacher. And there was an enormous surplus of teachers, so I was lucky to get a job. And I was a teacher for the first boat refugees, and it was quite challenging and emotionally quite tough too. I got very close to them, and I really, really enjoyed it. You know, we had in those days, this is a long time ago, right? This is like...
Yeah, it's...
And so there was no immigrants. There was, I think in my hometown village, there was one Chinese family restaurant and one Moluccan family, and the rest was all white people. So it's kind of like for my first engagement in Asians, which was amazing, and I loved the job and got them. After a year in 81, I decided to try to help some of my students to find their relatives. There was no internet, no communication. They had no clue where their relatives were. A little bit from possibly which refugee camp they're in. And so my wife and I visited the refugee camp and trying to find some of my students, and we succeeded in that. During that trip, we saw the work and we met some volunteers and saw some Dutch people who were working there as well. And we decided to go back and finish our last school year and go and work in refugee camps as volunteers. That's how we ended up here, basically.
Right, and you'd had some remarkable jobs that put you right next to the seats of power in this country for 10, 20, 30 years. But the harshest of the work must have been in the 1980s when you had 250,000 Cambodian refugees living up on the Thai border. The Khmer Rouge were still backed by the Chinese and active. The Vietnamese had invaded.
Yeah, that was a very tough period, really. And I learned a lot. I was very young and very eager to very quickly settle in. And I worked very hard to try to study Thai immediately and fluently in Thai in quite a short time and in Cambodian. And so I picked up a lot of things what happened. And I got emotionally quite engaged with the refugees. I can now imagine more if, like 40 years later, I look back at this, what's happening in the Palestinian area, what it is like for refugees to live like that. I mean, I remember, when these were attacks from Vietnamese tanks, often on the refugee camps, where aid workers were not allowed in. And, the resistance or the Vietnamese, they were on their own with the Thai army watching it, that it wouldn't spill over. Many, many times. We had like 60, 70 camps, little small camps and a couple of bigger camps. And ultimately they merged into 3 big camps and like 6, 7 smaller scattered Khmer Rouge camps. Back then it's called... the Royalist Site 8 and the Khmer Rouge camps, etc., etc. And it was like a really, really tough time for especially the first 4 years. And then the UN, I was a volunteer. The UN, they asked me to join them, the UNBRO program, United Nations Border Relief Operation. So I worked quite a while for them. And then my friend's wife, my friend Scott Lipper, and Scott was a deputy coordinator in the border, a good friend. And his wife was Musokua. She ran the Education and Social Service Program.
And of course, Secure is quite well known in this country for
yes.
political views.
Yes, and so I took over her job because they moved to Rome for the World Food Program. And for the first time ever, we had the big boss from SCAP, the resident coordinator overseeing UNDP, UNICEF, World Food Program, etc., etc. He's a South Korean guy. And he was interested to come to the refugee camps. He was also the boss, the big boss of Korea, of the UNRWA. And so he asked to see me in his first visit. And my field coordinator said, oh, okay, yeah, it's a Dutch guy. And so I talked to him. And so his name was YY Kim. He said, so what do you think about this education situation for the people in the border? I said, let me be very straight. I think it's actually disgusting. Young people are growing up in these camps already like 10, 15 years, and there's only allowed by the Thai authorities primary grade 1 and 2. 15, 16-year-olds, they have no, it's like outrageous. This is like a violation of children's rights. And he was very happy with my comments, and he said, come to meet me in Bangkok, and let's talk about this, because I will push very hard to get that mandate amended. And we got enormous amount of money for education. And I had the last 3 years I worked in the border, worked there as education coordinator for all the camps, and a hell of a job. And it was an enormous, difficult job, but very rewarding. And I kind of like had to pull the plug in 89, 90, late 89. It's like you know, day and night work for non-stop.
It was at that point too.
Also, the situation had changed. All the refugees were inside Thailand. The guerrillas were getting stronger and stronger. The Vietnamese troops started to pull out of Cambodia. There's more and more talks about it. And that was like the first 9 years of the work, which actually I took a short break while my friend Scott Leeper and his wife already had left Rome and were in
right, you were
Phnom
quite
Penh.
prepared, yourself and Scott.
Yeah.
And both of you were advising Hun Sen for many years. And the cabinet.
Well, we were working...
Demobbing. The demobilisation of the forces. There was 250,000, 300,000 people returned home.
My first 6 years, my first 6 years in Cambodia was with the Cambodian Red Cross,
right?
Cooperating with the International Federation of the Red Cross and the International Red Cross, but I was the sole advisor for the first years in the Cambodian Red Cross under Dr. Misamedi.
Right.
And it was like, you know, I came a year before UNTAC, so I was working under the state of Cambodia, and we were dealing with 230 IDPs, internally displaced people, coming from the border, which I thought is very serious and terrible for these people, and how could this happen, and da-da-da-da-da. When I came to Cambodia, working with the Red Cross, it was a world of difference. The people were under such a poverty and stress, and in enormous need of everything. No food, no shelter, no medication. Yes, in the border camps. They were in a border, they were fenced off in a military, Thai military coordinated place. But here, they had no protection. You know, the Vietnamese troops had pulled out already. It was the state of Cambodia army who were trying to deal with the border. Khmer Rouge getting stronger, and the Cape Left getting stronger. And I was an advisor of the Red Cross. The only help we had, don't forget, Cambodia was not recognized by the UN. It was only UNICEF and the World Food Programme who on a special deal were present in Cambodia. The rest, there was no UNDP, there was no WHO, there was no UNESCO, etc., etc. It's like the state of Cambodia, not recognized by the UN. The UN seat was still in the hands of the coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea, led by the Khmer Rouge, basically.
It was still Pol Pot.
Yeah.
But the complexion was changing. With the Vietnamese pulling out, you basically had the old factions and the old squabbles that had been locked in at the border. They were starting to run riot again over the country. And it was basically...
It was terrible, look. It was unbelievable because there were no means, you know, and the little means we had. I mean, the roads would take like 2 days or 3 days to get to Siem Reap, where a lot of displaced people were as well. Battambang was under attack. We couldn't go through Kampong Thom to Siem Reap because Storm District was in the hands of the Khmer Rouge, or heavily attacked continuously.
It was a big chunk of the north of the country.
There was like at least a third of the country. It was like heavily under attack, and it was a very difficult situation. For example, Ban Thi Minh Chey. There were no people in Ban Thi Minh Chey controlled under the government. They were displaced people in the temple around Swaisisabon, the capital of Antimite. It was like totally empty. And if they would still be kind of like a satellite villages just outside, the Khmer Rouge would come in and burn the settlement down, which we, with the little means we had of the Red Cross, tried to help people with. It was a very serious situation until finally the Paris Peace Agreement was signed in October 1991, right? And then UNAMI came, preparing for the returnees, and then suddenly my plate was like, whoa, full of work, because we were the Red Cross. We were the only institute suddenly basically recognized by the international partner as in country.
Sure.
The unit or the institution where they could work with. Basically, the state of Cambodia was like one of the 4 government groups officially, but of course, in reality, they were still in there with a network in control of the local authorities, etc., etc. But the international aid was going through the Red Cross, and we had to prepare for 325,000 refugees to be brought back and bring them out of the refugee camps with help of the UNHCR, mainly by train. We had to establish 6 reception centers, one in Bantiamin J, one in Siem Reap, 2 in Battambang, one in Pursat, and one in Phnom Penh. And the people would get in the border an interview, where do you want to go and what option do you want to take. And there was cash option. There was an option to get like a housing land package. And initially there was thought of a tool grant, etc., which never materialized. So people, a lot of them, they chose money package. So then they came in a temporary reception center, and we had to register them and say, do you have any relatives where, etc., and place them out.
Did they know where their relatives were? I mean, in those days, the families were extraordinarily.
And a lot of people chose for option Bantiamin J or Battambang, close to the border, don't forget, I mean, these people of like young people of early 20s, they never been in Cambodia. It was only the older people, and there were not all that many older people who had some knowledge of Cambodia. I mean, the refugee camps were there so long. If you think about 79 and you go back to, this is 91, the kids born in like, let's say 75, they'd never been or heard or saw anything about Cambodia. They were kind of like, they all
lived in the bush on the border, surrounded by landmines and warring forces.
Yeah, exactly.
Then came the UN peacekeepers, UNTAC, and you were in a prime position for when they arrived.
Yeah, the peacekeepers was a difficult situation too. I mean, it's kind of like very weird situation.
But I remember at the time, people were kind of yelling about, they're going to spend $2 billion and that's a waste of money on Cambodia. It's too much. And now when I look back, I just think it's a drop in the bucket, really, when you look back now what it was. But back then, it was horrendously appalling conditions.
Yeah, no, it was like the amounts of money nowadays is dumped in like Iraq war and in repatriation scenes and UN intervention scenes. Back then, it's a lot of talk. $2.5 billion, but it was an enormous, impressive operation because they shuttled in like I think 25,000 military from I don't know how many nationalities. We had people from Ghana, from Poland, from Uruguay, local police, from everywhere. Yeah. And many of them had no clue about anything in Cambodia. Many of them were working as teams together like international police, couldn't speak to each other in a common language.
And by that point you had learned Khmer.
Oh, yeah, I learned Khmer in the refugee camps already fluently, so I did all my work with the Cambodian Red Cross in Khmer. But for the people, it was like, the people in Cambodia, but also the returnees, it's like pretty chaotic. They had no clue what was going on, and they had uniformed people, like sometimes big, black, tall Africans, to scare them. Oh, you get on the truck, blah, blah, blah. And so, like, the whole operation worked surprisingly smooth, but for the people who went through it, must have been really difficult, very difficult, going back to your country, not knowing much about your country, not having a background with your relatives. I mean, even language was kind of like, language is a live thing. I mean, they would come back without knowing their way around. But I have to say, they were very patient, and the local people very welcoming their compatriots back. Even the Khmer Rouge, but people didn't know who was who, basically. But it was without internal problems. It was a smooth operation in that sense. And also the state of Cambodia, who actually still in power, they tried very hard to make the best of it for their returning people. It wasn't like, oh, Cambodians with us and returnees. No, it was like all Cambodian citizens. Very respectful. I think it was very respectful.
When you look back, a controversial point, I do remember, maybe it was reported wrong, but I do remember the UN and UNTAC basically announcing that they would disarm the factions, and then there seemed to be some kind of climb down in that they would not be disarming the factions, and they certainly would not be disarming the Khmer Rouge. Should they have gone harder after the factions? Could they have disarmed the Khmer Rouge? Did they have the firepower to do that?
Well, they probably could have. The Khmer Rouge was well armed and trained, but the UN was a very numerous, well-present establishment. But it was not their mandate.
Right.
It wasn't simply their mandate. It was not a discussion, should we go? Foreigners, including ourselves, we criticized highly the moment when the Khmer Rouge stopped them with a little soldier somewhere in the middle of nowhere trying to go to the Khmer Rouge headquarters. And UNTAC, they said, okay, we cannot go in. We refuse to get in. The Paris peace agreements had stated very clearly that it's a peacekeeping operation. So they were not able to force anything on them. There were a lot of military units, I'm pretty sure, and also a lot of UN and other people who would have wanted to do that, but it was not in question.
Right.
And we can speculate over the result, but as a consequence,
well, the war continued.
Basically the war continued. UNTAC troops were often under fire on Khmer Rouge troops, and the state of Cambodia was disarmed quite a lot. I mean, I remember very well the Dutch company in Swisopon. Everybody would move out, all the cars would stop, and confiscated all the weapons. And so there was quite a lot of disarmament, and the peace ultimately worked out, basically. But the Khmer Rouge was never disarmed, and they kept their military bases.
Right, and there were also efforts being made by some, certainly not all, to bring the Khmer Rouge back into Cambodian politics. If I remember correctly, they opted out of the elections in '93, and I don't think that a return of the Khmer Rouge back then or later on that it would happen again, but a return of the Khmer Rouge into Cambodian politics, I still think would have been absolutely catastrophic, traumatising, and the wrong thing for this country.
Yes, no, I think the whole situation of all the parties but the Khmer Rouge, they played it pretty cool and just, I started after the Khmer Rouge, after the big work of the Red Cross to work with a decentralization program. And one of the big things we were encouraged to do by the government, UNTAC had gone already, is trying to help the reconciliation, bring development in areas where there's still semi-Khmer Rouge control, try to get people integrated, challenge them out of the zones of the Khmer Rouge controlled areas, and that gradually happened. Also certain factions within the Khmer Rouge deserted earlier.
Sure, the defections were a big deal.
Yes, and that was done in a very smart and consistent way. We're trying not to force and not to fight, but, in negotiations. A lot of it successfully worked. The Khmer Rouge gradually integrated and lost a lot of power until the last bit in '98.
And they split among themselves and were basically left like a shag on a rock.
But other than in the areas where the Khmer Rouge were controlled, let's say the overlapping the dodgy areas, it was peaceful, and we could start working on pre-development activities. rehabilitation of infrastructures. I mean, don't forget, all the roads and bridges were totally a disaster. I mean, in the countryside, there was barely any roofs with zinc or roof tiles.
No,
it was all thatch and bamboo. It's kind of like it's a world of difference now.
The wet season was miserable.
Yeah. It's
mud, more mud.
Yeah. Unbelievable. The traffic, the moving around in the country was like a big challenge. Yeah.
How do you think Cambodia is faring now, given all these years you've spent here?
After this whole rehabilitation and etc. As I mentioned briefly, I worked with the Ministry of Interior, and through a lot of big donor programs like SIDA, UNDP, EU, the Netherlands, the Swiss corporation, a lot. And over many years, I mean, I started that in 96 to 2000 as a UN project, pilot project in Siem Reap called Decentralization, SELA program. That's 96 to 2000. Then I moved to Phnom Penh back, where I became an advisor in the Ministry of Interior, who were the champions of promoting and pushing local development, decentralized empowerment of local authorities. And first as a pilot, and then in 2001, the first commune elections were organized. And the Cambodian government established the National Committee for Subnational Democratic Development, which that brought us into another mode, in another period. We could really focus on trying to bring development in a sustainable way.
And this is still...
this is still working. It's not donor-driven anymore. It's entirely taken over by the government. It's one of these very unique examples where development projects are rarely sustainable. Because the money dries out, the project dies out.
But isn't the project supposed to be handed back to the locals?
But, here in this project, the government has taken over the entire financing. Right. It's run entirely through technical assistance from the government, paid for by the government, and still operating more or less the way as it was designed and focused. So I'm very happy with that, to see that. There's a lot of complaints left, right and center, but of course if you have
this is the funding regime that basically decentralizes capital from Phnom Penh out into the provinces and down to the Sangkat.
Yeah, basically straight from the Ministry of Finance through the Treasury, straight into the account of the commune, who manage it themselves. And that's been functioning quite a long time already, and now it's pretty successful also at district level. More complicated because it involves a lot of other ministries. The commune level was just giving them their own budget, their own rules and regulations, and focus with your own budget.
Right, and back then though there was nothing else.
There was nothing else.
Somewhere.
And now the government is generating quite a lot more revenue themselves, tax systems being in place. So now they provide also a development budget to the district and some to the provinces. And I think the whole development situation as far as the decentralization component is working really well.
Well, it lasts another 10, 15 years, and there was a reliance on Western donor money that's been replaced by Chinese investors. Donor money coming in from that, so it's all rather opaque, so it's a bit difficult to know exactly where it's coming from. But in regards to the big NGOs, those big international names that you've worked with, what were the big mistakes they made in Cambodia? Criticisms have been many, and I don't want to harp on that, but what were the bigger mistakes that, looking back, you wouldn't do it the same way again?
Well, there's always with the NGOs, it was very... we call barang driven. It was driven by foreigners with their philosophy and their double agenda often. Some of the agendas were maybe even political. Some were religious. Some was just kind of like running the show yourself. Employment for Westerners who would come in that NGO. I'm talking about NGOs are big projects,
and on big packages, and big money,
UN,
cars.
or UN and World Bank situations and ADB situations, very expensive consultants who basically come in and just direct and oversee the project, which is not unique for Cambodia. It's happening everywhere in the world.
Sure.
But yeah, there's a lot of things which, and as a government and as authorities, there's not a lot of choice because there's a strings attached with their money.
Right.
It's the money, Now it later moved into kind of like loans, where the government is much more powerful to say we want this and that, and then they control. There's still development projects coming with grants for technical assistance and technical support, who oversee and ensure transparency and avoid corruption and bidding processes, etc., but run by the government. And now the TA, the free TA component, is more or less disappeared as well.
What do you mean by that?
The technical assistance, so the coverage of the cost for foreigners to oversee big World Bank projects or ADB projects or IFA projects, that's also gone.
Yeah.
So, but the government, they, being a middle-income country now, they don't get like a lot of freebies anymore. It's loans, which they have to pay back. So, that whole situation has opened up opportunity or windows for Chinese investors, as you mentioned. But I've never seen any Chinese investors or projects being directly contributing a lot to development of Cambodia. It's been like a big infrastructure project, which is ultimately has to happen in any case, like the road construction or a bit hydro dam, but then run by the
Chinese labour.
Yes, so the benefit of those projects direct for the citizens of Cambodia in the long run, yes, but a lot of it is also like, you build a big dam, it's run by the Chinese, where's the revenue going and how's the payment back? In Cambodia, still little information flow, which would give people transparency or thought or opinions about. Nobody knows which loan is taken from the Chinese and how payment is made back and the revenue of generated electricity, etc. These are difficult issues which people are not informed about. People don't have access to that kind of information.
Those days are changing. In that the Chinese haven't come back post-COVID. There are issues here in Cambodia, from politics to the dirty words like human trafficking and corruption. But some of those issues have always been here, but donors have always carried on. How do you see the mix shaping up over the next few years? Perhaps return of Western governments, aid,
I get the feeling.
With Chinese.
I get the feeling that Cambodia, over these many years, there's one thing which we actually haven't discussed, Luke. It's like the enormous progress the young people have made with exposure in having studied overseas. I mean, there's lots of people now come back with PhDs from Japan, from Europe, from Australia, from America. These young people haven't been exposed. They have seen that, and they have human resources well underway of a serious development, so they can handle a lot more themselves. And also, this younger generation coming up, they'll look likely more critical and in another way to this kind of new economic developments, whether it's China or Japan or back from the West. But I think the West will definitely, the Cambodian people and also the young generation, I think they will welcome very much back.
A lot of them learned English where they didn't learn Chinese, and a lot of the Western businesses were swept aside by the incoming Chinese around 2015, 2016. It all changed, but there's still an infrastructure in place, human assets. There are people who have learned English, who have studied abroad, who worked with Western businesses, and I think there's still a place for those people.
I fully agree with you.
As you said, people are studying in Western countries.
Yeah. No, and traditionally, the respect and the openness with the Western world by Cambodian citizens and also the politics has been pretty strong and open. Okay, we are at the moment in a slightly different period, but that's not necessarily going to ruin relations with the West. I mean, they can, in harmony, still have heavy investments and economic exchanges with the West while they continue to have support through China. You know, as long as it's an economic development. I don't think there is it has to be either or. It can be and.
Right. And, I mean, you put your money where your mouth is as well. You were sitting by the Pol Pot River at Villavadici, which you've basically grown out of a single bedroom riverside hut, and now it's kind of a magnificent 4-5-star resort.
No, it's not like that, but it's a nice place, and this is my home. Sure. I'm still going back to the Netherlands to visit my kids. One of them lives here, by the way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is my home, and I will stay in Cambodia for the rest of my life. And I'm still very engaged and love the place, etc., etc. But there is a lot of, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since I came here. It's now 42 years ago. I was 25. I was 25 and I left, and I'm now turning 67. So it's a long time. I've seen a lot of changes. 90% for the best. It was also inevitable over such a long time that things terribly go wrong. But the overall course has been very, very positive.
And you're starting to see that return of tourists post-COVID. Things seem to be maybe picking up a little bit.
It's picking up a bit now. I think it's an important element for Cambodian young people to continue interacting with the West as well as with the Japanese, the Koreans, and exposure and interaction. And it's a good thing. And Cambodia is a popular country. Mm-hmm. It is in a dip because of all kinds of reasons at the moment, mainly COVID, and also things are getting expensive, flights are expensive, and in the world economy is at the moment a bit in a dip, but I think it'll be back.
On that note, Hans van Zoggel, thanks very much.
You're welcome, Luke. Thank you.